Gun control activism is a multi-pronged effort. It requires a laser focus on helping to shape legislation and policies, but you also have to be involved in the grassroots movements to drive community engagement to keep the pressure on for change. I spoke with activist Gregory Jackson in our DC studios about his efforts to push for sensible gun reform efforts. Greg Jackson is a community organizer, advocate, and communications professional who recently served as the Deputy Director of the White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention. In 2015, he was the youngest appointee of Mayor Muriel Bowser as Director of Community Relations and Services in Washington, D.C. He is currently Executive Director of the Community Justice Action Fund. You're an advocate for sensible gun reform, which I think you're very clear about, but you're also a survivor of gun violence. Can you go back in time and kind of describe what happened?
Yeah. Well, it's not as exciting as it sounds, but I was walking home with my cousins, one late night after a dinner party, and we literally took the wrong turn and we saw two guys arguing. And I think one of the guys thought we were part of the conflict or backup or something, and pulled out a gun and started shooting. And I was shot. The bullet that hit me hit two arteries. And I'll never forget that feeling of, we obviously were running after we were getting shot at, and it just went from running to hopping to crawling and just hiding behind a building. And that was actually only 4 blocks from where we are right now. And the bullet that hit me hit 2 arteries. And so I found myself really bleeding to death. And I was raced to the hospital via ambulance. And when I got there, just in and out of consciousness, as opposed to being rolled into an emergency room, I was rolled into a side room with interrogators, and had to go through a whole police investigation, 3 rounds of questioning while I was bleeding to death. And it was really hard because I was fighting for my life and fighting for my innocence at the same time. And eventually, they released me, and I met my surgeon. And he shared that I only had about 30 minutes left to live based on blood loss, and that there was still a 50% chance I wouldn't make it. And so I went into surgery, not knowing if I would live or die. And also just realizing, critical moments for my survival were lost or wasted, because I was being seen as a suspect first and a person second. But luckily, I made it through my first surgery. Went through 6 different surgeries, about a 6-month recovery window. The bullet that hit me, it tore through my calf, so it damaged two arteries pretty bad. So it took about 6 months to learn how to walk again and kind of find some form of normalcy. But throughout that experience, I just learned firsthand, how much trauma people go through, how much trauma families go through, but also how America has looked at this issue in inner cities. It's always kind of been a crime to solve, not a public health crisis to prevent. And that stuck with me. And so I kind of committed from that, really from the first day out of surgery, that if I could ever get back on my feet, I would do all I can to make sure no one else goes through what I went through.
When you're walking, first of all, it's a dinner party. Everybody's got to be up. This is fantastic. Yeah. You turn a corner, all of a sudden your life is changed dramatically. Was there a fear factor? What kind of walk us through the moments before the gun comes out?
Oh, yeah. It was seconds, I think by the time we even realized that there was an argument going on, and there wasn't even a physical argument. It was just 2 people yelling at each other. By the time we noticed it, we were like, oh, okay, we'll just walk around. And then one of the guys pulled out a gun, and I was shot within maybe 2 seconds, 3 seconds of the gun being pulled out. And so there wasn't a lot of time to react. I had enough time to turn around and maybe take 2 strides before I was shot. And that was a real lesson for me. And I think a lot of folks think that, it's like the movies where there's shootouts and you can duck behind buildings and whoever gets to draw first. But it's not like that in real life. Usually these instances happen, within 2 or 3 seconds, and people are lost or injured. And there's not a lot of opportunity to defend or protect yourself. The best thing you can do is try to get out of the way, get down, get low, get out the way. And I know that saved my life. If I had, stood my ground or tried to say anything, he would have shot me, in the chest or the face. And so, I guess the instinct to flee was the right one for sure for me.
So we touched on fear, but let's talk about anger. I mean, the fact that here you are, a survivor, a victim, and now you're having to like plead your case. Look, and you could die.
Yeah. I was furious. I mean, that rage still kind of burns in me in a lot of different ways, that how I was treated. And it wasn't just police either, right? It was, you know, the firefighters who showed up on the scene. Oh, you'll be fine. It's like, whoa, there's no sense of urgency. It was, you know, my nurse, when I came out of surgery, she was lecturing me about my lifestyle and how I need to change my lifestyle. And I was like, you don't know anything about my lifestyle. You know, I had one of the highest honors in my college. You know, I worked at executive level of my organization at the time, but just because I was a black male, I was being deemed as, you know, deserving of this or contributing to being shot. And so, yeah, all that was really, really frustrating. And, you know, I worked in politics at the time. And when I was shot, this was 3 days after the failed vote for universal background checks in wake of the Sandy Hook shooting. And so when I turned on the TV, gun violence was, you know, just running pretty aggressively. And I saw, you know, Democrats and Republicans and even people I worked for, you know, making excuses of how they couldn't take action, that this issue wasn't a big deal or a big priority right now, or we have to play the long game. And it just felt like the entire world didn't care about people like me who were being shot and killed, and that our trauma and our pain was an afterthought or, you know, a second tier problem, when it was literally life or death for me. And at that point, tens of thousands of Americans per year.
More than half of all adults in the United States report that they or a family member have been involved in a gun violence-related incident. You call it a public health crisis, and I think one of the words I've heard in both your responses so far is the word trauma, which is, I think, key. People think somebody's shot, it's terrible, it's a wound, but the wound's much more than the physical wound and recovering from that. It's the mental wound, and it's not just you. I mean, if there's somebody there witnessing this, it impacts them as well. Talk to me about, you know, I mean, you've obviously had some PTSD, I would think, you know, reliving it, nightmares. Talk to us about that.
Yeah. I mean, people think of it as just a wound, but I think it's important to really internalize that someone tried to kill me, right? And we watch horror movies and we see like folks running through the woods and going through these crazy things. But at the end of the day, like when someone tries to kill you, it shifts your entire psyche on life and relationships and just perspective on how people treat each other and what common decency looks like, you know. And I've always been a fairly optimistic person. I still am, but I never would imagine someone would go to those depths, especially without even knowing my name or knowing me. And those feelings I've gone through, you know, a lot of folks have gone through. And when we think about it as a health crisis, it's the physical toll is one thing, which is really, really intense, though. I mean, this is the number one cause of death for youth in America, number one cause of premature death for Black men under 44, leading cause of newly disabled Americans. So many people are shot, you know, their lifestyle has changed forever. It's also leading cause for pregnant women ahead of childbirth complications because of domestic violence related deaths. And this is physically the most destructive crisis we have. But the trauma is huge as well. I mean, it just ripples. And now I think it's between 1 in 5 Americans know someone who's been shot or dealt with some type of firearm related incident. And so you deal with that fear, that depression, that anger. But more importantly, you walk out into a world that you don't think is safe and you don't trust and you don't know what's around the next corner or where that next step could lead you, or someone that you should work with or you should wave to as a neighbor, you know, they're processed as a threat. And so for me, I dealt with that a lot. I had, you know, nightmares for years. I still do. I had terrible time sleeping. That was 12 years ago. I still struggle with that. I still have physical trauma. I'm still in therapy now. And, you know, this will be a lifelong journey for me. And almost every survivor I've met, even if they haven't been shot themselves, if they lost a loved one, they do have a whole lifelong trajectory of trauma to navigate.
44% of adults in the U.S. lack access to support services to help them cope with the emotional trauma following an incident of gun violence. Does it drive you crazy that, you know, it seems like you're pushing the the rock up the hill, so to speak, that it's still such an uphill battle for somebody like you to be out there talking about this?
Yeah, I mean, it's been hard. I will say I went through maybe 7 or 8 years where I felt like we were making no progress and there was no hope in sight. But for survivors, we don't have the luxury of turning a blind eye from this issue or giving up. This is something we live with every single day. And so win or lose, I'm still in the ring. I'm still a part of the fight. And so it has been really hard, but I think the last few years have been really exciting. We've seen a huge shift with the previous administration. We saw the first law passed in 30 years. We saw over $42 billion invested in violence prevention. We've seen a 27% reduction in homicides in major cities. The average reduction in the last 2 years has been over 40%. So I think we've actually turned a huge corner on this issue, and numbers are dropping drastically. Now we're seeing cities that had, triple digit murders are now in the single digits, right? Like Boston is down 82%. Newark, New Jersey had less than 27 homicides last year, which is incredible when you think of the scale, the size, and they're still dealing with poverty. There's still a ton of firearms, but I think we are at a point where we're starting to figure out real solutions to at least reduce homicide. And then we have to dig deeper into accidental shootings and suicide. But a lot of those interpersonal conflicts, I think we figured out a way to cool them down. And so that's been really exciting. And as traumatic as this has been, it's hard to celebrate and think about lives that saved. You just see somebody walking down the street. You don't know that they could have been harmed, but it's fun to imagine, graduations instead of funerals, and keeping my eye on that ball, that we're kind of fighting a fight that you may not always see the spoils or rewards, but we're saving lives. I think the big thing is we've allowed kind of the gun lobby to simplify this debate into the Second Amendment. And this is not really a debate about rights of to have a gun or not have a gun. This is a public health crisis. And when we had a public health crisis of automobile deaths, the debate was not, well, should we just stop having cars? The debate was, okay, how do we make the car safer? How do we shift behavior? How do we create more accountability for those who abuse this right? How do we make sure there's more steps towards getting access that ensure that you're a reasonable user of a vehicle? And I think if we can effectively shift the language and the narrative to that point, then we can start to get to real solutions. And I think the last couple of years we've seen that. I mean, the U.S. Surgeon General named this a public health crisis and rolled out the first public health advisory in U.S. history. We're starting to see hospitals and health systems start to lean in, community organizations lean in. And I think a lot of that is, if you see it as a health crisis, you can say, okay, there are hundreds of ways to chip away at this problem. But if we make it a simple debate of have a gun or don't, I think that's going to be a really hard decision for most Americans to process, considering our long culture and history with firearms.
The Bipartisan Safer Communities Act was signed in 2022, expanding background checks for firearms purchasers under the age of 21, further criminalizing arms trafficking, and adding stronger protections to victims of domestic violence, amongst other regulations. You run up cars.
Mm-hmm.
People don't think anything that they've got to get their cars registered, they've got to have a license, they've got to have insurance. Like there's all these layers. You can still drive the car.
Yeah.
And yet the thought of like universal background checks or any of this kind of stuff that people would argue, no, we can't have that.
Yeah.
It seems maddening to me. But I imagine it has to be for you in a sense.
Yeah, no, it's frustrating, but I think we'll get there. I mean, there was a point in America where no one wanted seatbelts, and there were protests against seatbelts, right? And there was even ads of people saying, we're against seatbelts, like anti-seatbelt ads, right? And we now, foot on your seatbelt, you didn't even think about it. So I think we'll get there. I think we just have to really kind of diversify the menu of solutions and start to focus on common ground. And so right now, a great example is that people are saying, well, okay, mental health plays a major role. Okay, we can start there. How do we invest in more mental health resources and support for youth that are at risk or elder men that are at risk? Recognizing that with homicides, the biggest community is young Black Americans or young Black men. With suicide, the biggest community is older white men. So we can pour more mental health resources to engage elder white men and young Black Americans and maybe figure out how do we prevent that moment of crisis where they get a firearm So we can start there to chip at that. We can look at things like gun trafficking. All people agree that we shouldn't illegally traffic firearms on either side of the aisle. But we know that's a huge source of illegal guns and crime guns. Like that's an argument we can focus on. Safe storage is another one. We found that 80% of youth suicides, the gun come from the home. 76% of school shootings, the guns come from the home. So yes, we know a school shooting is terrible, but when we look at the source of the firearm, there's an obvious point we can intervene. If parents were more responsible in locking up their guns and keeping your ammunition away, we could cut down school shootings by half or more. And so I think the way we get there is identify these areas that people already have agreement on, get them as far down the line as possible, and then say, okay, now that we've reduced this crisis by 30%, guess what? We can add this next piece and maybe we can keep going. But I think historically, the battles have been so polarized, like assault weapons banned and, should you have a gun or not? And what is the age? And I think we're focusing on the big battles as opposed to starting with the common ground and working our way out.
And so you mentioned being in the arena.
Yeah.
What's it like going and talking to somebody who might have a distinctly different point of view and trying to get them to look at this differently, like you just suggested?
Yeah. Well, the beauty of it is that, no one wants to be shot or killed, right? Everyone wants to be safe. So, and no matter how pro-gun enthusiastic they are, they want to live a safe life, a safe and healthy life, and they want to protect the family. And so a lot of my discussions are actually just starting there. Like, okay, we have the same goal. How do we get here? How do we get there? And, I'm also a gun owner. I grew up in rural Virginia. My dad's a farmer. We hunted most of the time when we were young, so, my little Winchester rifle, I can always connect there. But I think the way I go into conversations is just finding that common ground, recognizing that we both want to be safe, that gun ownership is not the only way that we can address this issue. We can look at responsible gun ownership, safe storage. We can also look at accountability for the broader gun industry, and we can pour more resources into behavioral change and some of the root causes that lead to violent incidents. And usually if you walk your way in that way, I can find common ground. We'll always find places for disagreement, no matter how far left or how far right or how pro-gun or anti-gun someone is. But the beauty of this health crisis is that there's so many different solutions that can play a role that usually I can find a good handful of things that we can work together on. And I'm excited about that. I think that's a very practical way of advocacy, of policy making, of legislating. And, in today's kind of clickbait social media world, that's not the sexy part. Like people want to get to the hot part and get into the big dispute and the debate so they can post it. But when you really want to fix a problem, you have to start with common ground and kind of some of those solutions that everyone can agree on first.
Let me go back to turn the corner. You come from this dinner party, it's a great evening, you turn a corner, your life changed dramatically. Do you think if that argument didn't occur and no gun was pulled out, that this would be your avenue of life, that you might be doing something differently?
Yeah. I mean, God knows what he's doing. And, my uncle is funny. He came to visit me in the hospital, and my Uncle Andy, and he said, boy, you do a lot of things right in this world, but one thing you can't get right is dying. And yeah, I just died laughing. I remember that. But, I think there's definitely a reason that I survived, and it definitely charged me down this path. And I always tell people that, sometimes there are these big issues and you assume that there's a lot of folks out there working and they're trying to figure it out and they can't get it done. But with me in this issue, I realized that I was a really important part of the puzzle. Like there were already movements, there were already organizations and activists and leaders, but there wasn't someone that could like charge into Washington and charge into Capitol Hill and push, congressionally and ultimately push in the White House to get a lot of this progress done. And that was that piece of the puzzle. And I take a lot of pride in that. And I just try to remind folks, don't ever assume that someone else is doing the good work for you, that you can't play a role, because you might be that really special, part of the recipe to really create that impactful change. And so I'm really proud of it. I'm very thankful. And believe it or not, that trauma, it feels more like a tattoo than a scar, a lot of times, that as a reminder of what I've been through, but also the challenges that that I've been gifted enough and charged with addressing it.
So what advice would you give someone who's watching this who wants to do something about this issue?
Well, the first thing is that there are a lot of solutions that work. So I encourage you to dig in, know that there are real answers, find those answers and figure out how you can contribute. And if you don't see leaders around you that are willing to step up and do it, then maybe you're that next leader that needs to do it. And we're seeing that in Congress. We now have 4 survivors of gun violence that are in Congress. Stephen Horsford, who lost his father to gun violence, Lucy McBath, who lost her son to gun violence, now are major leaders on Capitol Hill, and their entire journey started through trauma. So if you have that frustration and that anger, use that as fuel, because we need you.
All right, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much.
Yeah, no problem.